Hello, Planeswalkers. My name is Eric, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Bane Alley Magic. Today, on the eve of Ravnica Allegiance's official release, we're going to be talking about Lavinia, Azorius Renegade. But before we do, I'd just like to remind you to please hit that like button, or maybe even that subscribe button. It helps out a lot. So, Lavinia is a 2/2 human soldier for a white and a blue. And she says, each opponent can't cast non-creature spells with converted mana cost greater than the number of lands that player controls. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. So, I'll admit, at first I bashed on Lavinia, and I didn't think she was that good. But then I played a few Commander games, and I tried to imagine how they would have gone differently if I had controlled Lavinia, and I realized that she would have done amazing, and would have probably saved me several times. Control is not normally my style, so I found it very interesting building this deck. And what's probably most unique about my build is that it's very creature heavy and it hates on artifacts a lot. So much so that I didn't even put in a soul ring. The reason I put so much artifact hate in the deck is that Lavinia only partially gets around your opponents being able to use mana rocks to their advantage. So let's say, for example, your opponent has 3 lands, a soul ring, and a worn power stone, which is basically another soul ring. In total, they have access to 3 mana from their lands and 4 from their artifacts, so 7 mana total. Now, Lavinia will prevent that opponent from casting a spell with total converted mana cost 4 or greater, but because the opponent, because she does not prevent the opponents from casting spells with converted mana cost 3 or less, the opponent can still cast multiple smaller spells in a turn using their artifacts still. So the artifacts are still helping the opponent out. So the combination of artifact hate and Lavinia's ability should shut down most of our opponents completely. Next, let's discuss further the effects that Lavinia shuts down and those that she doesn't. So, spells like Force of Will, where you can do something alternatively instead of paying its casting cost, you can't do the alternative casting cost. You have to pay the normal casting cost. So Force of Will, you can pay 1 life and exile a blue card from your hand rather than paying Force of Will's mana cost, and it says counter target spell. Well, now they have to pay 5 mana for Force of Will. Next is a Pact of Negation, which is normally just 0 to cast. Any spell that's just converted mana cost 0 is automatically countered with Lavinia. And so Pact of Negation says counter target spell. At the beginning of your next upkeep, you may pay 5 mana. If you don't, you lose the game. Next, we have spells like Torment of Hailfire and Jaya's Immolating Inferno, which are X spells, so they have X in their casting cost. And normally, players pump up these spells with their artifacts and their other ramp spells in order to make them huge and just win the game with them. So Lavinia makes these spells a lot weaker, and they can only pump into X the amount of lands they have. So Torment of Hailfire is X black black, and it says repeat the following process X times. Each opponent loses 3 life unless that player sacrifices a non-land permanent or discards a card. So you can see how that could win the game if someone just has, tons of treasure tokens and, several ramp spells like a, Dark Ritual, Pyretic Ritual, things like that. Then they get Torment of Hailfire off for things like 20 mana and just win the game. So, next we got Jaya's Immolating Inferno, X red, legendary sorcery, so it can only be cast if you control a legendary creature or planeswalker, but really good spell because it deals X damage to each of up to 3 targets. Next, we have the spells that still work. So Kalia of the Vast is a creature that, we'll skip all the text, but basically when she attacks, you just get to put an angel, demon, or dragon from your hand onto the battlefield. So since you're not casting the spell, you're just putting it onto the battlefield, Lavinia has no effect. So Kalia of the Vast still works. And then we have Thran Temporal Gateway and Quicksilver Amulet, which are both artifacts that can basically tap for 4 mana to put some sort of permanent from your hand directly onto the battlefield. And again, since you're not casting those spells, you're just able to do it, and Lavinia will have no effect because, she only cares about when a player casts a spell. So, let's get into the Lavinia deck, starting with the creatures. First, we have Weathered Wayfarer, which is the first of our creature ramp. Again, since we don't have many artifacts that ramp, we have a lot of creatures that ramp, and we have spells that ramp. So, Weathered Wayfarer is 1 white for a 1/1 human nomad cleric, and you can pay a white and tap it to search your library for a land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Then shuffle your library. Activate this ability only if an opponent controls more lands than you, which often happens when you're not playing green, so this card is great, a little bit expensive, but I think Lavinia really needs it. Next we have Serra Ascendant, 1 white for a 1/1 lifelink human monk, and as long as you have 30 or more life, Serra Ascendant gets +5/+5 and has flying. So a 6/6 flying lifelink is always a good deal for 1 white mana. It will make enemies at the table, but it is just such a great card. I had to include it. And you're playing control. We have lots of ways to tap down our opponent's creatures, so Serra Ascendant should be able to get through some damage, gain you some life, get you ahead of the game. Going back to Weathered Wayfarer, I forgot to mention that Weathered Wayfarer can get you any land, not just a basic land, so you can get any land with it. Pretty awesome. Moving on to Orozco's Explorer. For 1 and a white, you get a 2/2 Cat Scout, and when it enters the battlefield, search your library for up to X planes cards, where X is the number of players who control more lands than you. Reveal those cards, put them into your hand, and then shuffle your library. So again, this doesn't say basic planes, and we have several non-basic planes in the deck that we can also search out. Next we have Mist Meadow Witch, 1 and a hybrid blue-white for a Kithkin Wizard, which is a 1/1, and it says you can pay 4 mana, 2 a white and a blue, to exile target creature and then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So what we have here is a flicker effect where we're exiling our own creatures and bringing them back to get their enter the battlefield effects, and so that is a sub-theme of this deck. It's not the complete theme of this deck, so I don't have like Panharmonicon or Conjurer's Closet, but there is a little sub-theme in here of flickering because it's just really powerful with blue-white. Next we have Selfless Spirit, 1 and a white for a 2/1 flying spirit cleric, and you can sacrifice it at any time, instant speed, and creatures you control gain indestructible until the end of the turn. So really helps out greatly with the board wipes. Everyone knows that a board wipe isn't going to work on you until they get rid of your Selfless Spirit, which you can always sacrifice in response to their removal spell to just make your creatures indestructible. Next we have Imposing Sovereign, 1 and a white for a 2/1 human. Creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. So this is the first of our sort of Kismet effects. If you don't know Kismet, it's an older card, but we have lots of these types of spells in the deck. You'll see more of them coming up. The important thing is that this really slows down the opponents. Not only do they not have haste anymore, their flash ability becomes less useful. They can't flash in a creature to block, and more importantly, on their main phase, they can't really cast blockers. It's so important in the game to be able to say, all right, well, I can cast this creature, and it can block the onslaught to come. But this prevents that. They can't cast blockers. They are unable to block for an entire turn, which is a great advantage. Next we have Kataki War's Wage, 1 and a white for a 2/1 legendary spirit, and it says all artifacts have, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice this artifact unless you pay 1 mana. So here's our first piece of hardcore artifact hate. Every single artifact on the battlefield, you have to pay 1 mana at the beginning of your upkeep or sacrifice it. So we don't have many artifacts at all in this deck. Those that we do have, we don't mind sacrificing. So continuing, we have Knight of the White Orchid, 2 white for a 2/2 human knight with first strike, and when Knight of the White Orchid enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, you may search your library for a plains card, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. And again, it doesn't say basic plains, so you can get any plains, put it directly onto the battlefield. Great card for 2 white mana. Next we have Kinjali Sunwing, 2 and a white for a 2/3 dinosaur with flying, and it says creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. There we are again, creatures entering tapped. Great advantage. Next we have Deputy of Detention, 1 a white and a blue for a 1/3 Vidalcan Wizard, and when Deputy of Detention enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent and opponent controls, and all other non-land permanents that player controls with the same name as that permanent until Deputy of Detention leaves the battlefield. So This is just like Detention Sphere, but it's on a creature. Really great creature card. I love putting it in this deck. Next we have Reflector Mage. 1, a white and a blue for a 2/3 human wizard, and when Reflector Mage enters the battlefield, return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. That creature's owner can't cast spells with the same name as that creature until your next turn. So really great for getting rid of a problematic creature for a whole turn and a half. Really cool card, especially when you start flickering it, right, with things like Eldrazi Displacer. But really quickly, back to Deputy of Detention. I forgot to mention that if someone's playing tokens, this will get rid of all of those tokens that have the same name, if you didn't catch that. All right, so Eldrazi Displacer is 2 and a white for a 3/3 Eldrazi with Devoid, so it technically has no color. You can pay 2 and a colorless mana to exile another target creature, then return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. So, unlike most of the bounce effects that return things at the end of the turn or something like this, this returns it back to the battlefield right away. So you can get that flicker effect on Reflector Mage right away. We do have plenty of sources of colorless mana in this deck to pay for that diamond mana in our land base. Next we have Pilgrim's Eye, 3 mana for an artifact Thopter, 1/1 flying. And when Pilgrim's Eye enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. Next we have Spell Queller, 1 a white and a blue for a 2/3 spirit with flash and flying. And when Spell Queller enters the battlefield, you get to exile target spell with converted mana cost 4 or less. When Spell Queller leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner may cast that card without paying its mana cost. What's really great about this is, by the time Spell Queller leaves the battlefield, perhaps that spell might be useless to its controller, so it might completely negate a spell. Next we have Thalia, Heretic Cathar, 2 and a white for a 3/2 human soldier with first strike, and she says creatures and non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. So not only creatures but also non-basic lands. Really slows down the opponents. Next we have Skittering Surveyor, 3 mana for a 1/2 construct creature. When Skittering Surveyor enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. Another great little flicker target, to just get more and more lands. Next we have Daxus of Meletis, 1 a white and a blue for a 2/2 human soldier. Daxus of Meletis can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. And whenever Daxus of Meletis deals combat damage to a player, you exile the top card of that player's library, gain life equal to that card's converted mana cost, and until the end of the turn you get to cast that card, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast that spell. So a lot of text, but man, it really is powerful to be able to steal your opponent's spells, and you don't have to, worry about what color your mana is to cast it. So card advantage here for sure. Same with Solemn Simulacrum. 4 mana for a 2/2 Golem, and when Solemn Simulacrum enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, put that card on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. And when Solemn Simulacrum dies, you may draw a card. So another great flicker target right here. We got lots of great flicker targets here. And here's another flickering creature, a creature that flickers. Brago, King Eternal, is 2 a white and a blue for a 2/4 spirit with flying. And when Brago deals combat damage to a player, exile any number of target non-land permanents you control and return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. So yeah, this guy gets really wacky, really crazy quickly. My friend actually has a Brago King Eternal deck, and it is off the hook. It is crazy when you're just bouncing everything like that. Really cool if you have a bounce theme like we do. Next we have Grand Arbiter Augustin the 4th. For 2 a white and a blue, it's a 2/3 legendary human advisor, and it says white spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, blue spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and spells your opponents cast cost 1 more to cast. So what's really great about this is if you're playing a spell like Brago King Eternal, which is both white and blue, it's going to cost 2 less to cast. Next we have Loxodon Gatekeeper, 2 a white and a white for a 2/3 elephant soldier that says artifacts, creatures, and lands your opponents control all come into play tapped. Super awesome. Next, we have Lavinia of the 10th, the counterpart to Lavinia Azorius Renegade. So, Lavinia of the 10th is 3, a white and a blue for a 4/4 human soldier, which has protection from red. And when Lavinia of the 10th enters the battlefield, you get to detain each non-land permanent your opponent's control with converted mana cost 4 or less. So, Lavinia is an awesome flicker target here. Lavinia of the 10th. I mean, if you can keep flickering this with something like Eldrazi Displacer, you are just completely removing all of your opponent's non-land permanents with converted mana cost 4 or less over and over again each turn. It's really awesome. The same with Cloud Blazer, another great flicker target. 3, a white and a blue for a human scout, which is 2/2 with flying. And when Cloud Blazer enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life and draw 2 cards. So you keep flickering it, you keep gaining life, drawing more and more cards. Consecrated Sphinx is 4 and 2 blue for a 4/6 Sphinx with flying, and whenever an opponent draws a card, you may draw 2 cards. Yeah, if this survives even just one round around the table, this guy can draw you like 10 cards easily. Really powerful draw card creature. Next we have Azor the Lawbringer, 2 white and 2 blue, so 6 mana total, for a 6/6 legendary Sphinx with flying, and when Azor the Lawbringer enters the battlefield, each opponent can't cast instant or sorcery spells during that player's next turn. And whenever Azor attacks, you may pay X, a white and 2 blue. If you do, you gain X life and draw X cards, which is basically a spell that's called Sphinx's Revelation. So whenever Azor attacks, you get to do a Sphinx's Revelation. Really great. Also a great flicker target. Your opponents can still cast instants during other players' turns, but honestly, being able to negate your opponent's sorcery spells is a really powerful effect. Next we have Azorius Skyguard, 4 a white and a blue for a 3/3 human knight with flying and first strike, and it says creatures your opponents control get -1/-0. Yeah, really going to lower the amount of damage that we're going to be taking. Next we have Nezahal Primal Tide, 5 and 2 blue for a 7/7 Elder Dinosaur. Nezahal Primal Tide can't be countered. You have no maximum hand size. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, draw a card, and you can discard 3 cards to exile Nezahal and return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So I put Nezahal in almost every blue deck I have because it just draws you a ton of cards. It really does. Unfortunately, I don't have Rhystic Study in this deck because, like I said, we have a lot of artifact hate. We also have a little bit of enchantment hate, so I figured Rhystic Study we just get blown up too easily with our own cards. So Nezahal, on the other hand, gets around that, and what's really great about Nezahal is that last effect. Being able to protect Nezahal, I mean, you can even do this in response to blocking, so you block, you prevent the blocking damage, and you save Nezahal from dying by just discarding 3 of the cards that Nezahal drew you. Nezahal draws you tons of cards, so you can probably just discard 3 lands, and you get to save her. So, really great card. Moving along, we got Colossal Whale, 5 and 2 blue for a 5/5 whale, which has Island Walk, so it can't be blocked as long as the defending player controls an island. And whenever Colossal Whale attacks, you may exile target creature defending player controls until Colossal Whale leaves the battlefield. So a bit of temporary removal there. Also some super sweet artwork. Love that artwork there. Next, we have our last 4 bombs in the deck, the biggest creatures with the highest converted mana costs, starting with our 2 Praetors. We have Elish Norn, Grand Cenobite, 5 and 2 white for a 4/7 legendary Praetor with Vigilance, and it says other creatures you control get +2/+2, and creatures your opponents control get -2/-2. So you're just going to be killing tons of your opponent's creatures as soon as you cast this, and preventing them from casting more creatures, because lots of those creatures are just going to enter the battlefield and die, and all of your creatures get huge. I mean, this is a difference of 4 power here. This is definitely game-ending. You can just cast Elish Norn and end the game a lot if you have enough creatures to just deal lots of combat damage. Next we have Jin-Gitaxias Core Augur, 8 and 2 blue, so that's 10 mana total for a 5/4 Praetor, which also has Flash, and at the beginning of your end step, draw 7 cards. Each opponent's maximum hand size is reduced by 7, so unless they have a Reliquary Tower or something like that, they just have to discard their whole hand at the end of their turn. 2 really powerful Praetors, both that are going to get targeted early on, so, you'll be lucky if they survive around the table. I did put in a few spells to protect our creatures, so we might see those pop up. But again, we have lots of artifact hate, so we don't have Swiftfoot Boots, we don't have Lightning Greaves, but we do have some spells that are going to protect our creatures. Next we have Kozilek, the Great Distortion, 8 and 2 colorless, so 10 mana total, for a 12/12 Eldrazi, and when you cast Kozilek, the Great Distortion, if you have fewer than 7 cards in hand, you draw cards equal to the difference. So if you have Kozilek and 3 other cards in your hand, when you cast Kozilek, you're going to be drawing 4 cards. And Kozilek has Menace, so it can't be blocked except for by 2 or more creatures. Really powerful on a 12/12. And most importantly of all, you can discard a card with converted mana cost X to counter target spell with converted mana cost X. So Kozilek turns your entire hand into counter spells, something that not a lot of people remember, and I think it's important to remember. It's one of the most powerful controlling effects that Kozilek has, just being able to use anything in your hand as a counter spell, as long as it has the same converted mana cost as the spell someone else is trying to counter, or is trying to cast. And if, someone is trying to cast a spell with converted mana cost 0, you could discard a land and counter that spell. Thankfully, we have Lavinia out, so that spell would probably get countered anyway. Next, we have Kozilek, Butcher of Truth, 10 mana for a 12/12 Eldrazi, and when you cast this spell, you just draw 4 cards automatically, and it has Annihilator 4, so when this creature attacks, the defending player sacrifices 4 permanents. Really nasty. And finally, when Kozilek, Butcher of Truth is put into a graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles their library, their graveyard into their library. So this is our little piece of mill protection here. If Kozilek goes to the graveyard from anywhere, from the library, if we discard it, what have you, we get to shuffle our graveyard back into our library, so preventing someone from milling us out, hopefully. Alright, on to some other spells. These are our kind of more controlling spells in the deck. Like I said, we have lots of those Kismets. These are enchantments, so they may get blown up, but we have plenty of other things that can keep our opponent's stuff tapped down. And if we cast one of these next 3 spells early on in the game, it's just such a huge advantage. So Blind Obedience is 1 and a white for an enchantment that has Extort, so whenever you cast a spell, you may pay a white or a black, and if you do, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain that much life. And it says artifacts and creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. And just a reminder that anything in the reminder text doesn't actually have to be on the card, so a monocolored Extort card can go in a monocolored deck, even though it has technically 2 mana symbols in the reminder text. Again, reminder text doesn't count towards cards' color identity. Next, we have Authority of Consuls, 1 white for an enchantment. Creatures your opponent's control enter the battlefield tapped, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you gain 1 life. Next, we have Frozen Aether, 3 and a blue for an enchantment. Artifacts, creatures, and lands your opponent's control come into play tapped. This is basically the card Kismet, except Kismet is 3 and 1 white instead of 3 and 1 blue. And I just didn't have room for Kismet. I really wanted to put it in the deck, but I felt like Frozen Aether was more important because we needed a blue version of this spell. Next, we have Counterspell, 2 blue for an instant, counter target spell. We have Render Silent, 1 white and 2 blue for an instant, counter target spell. Its controller can't cast spells this turn. So these are our 2 counter spells. What's a blue deck without a couple of counter spells? Come on. Next we have Orim's Chant, one of the coolest, countering type of spells in the game, I think. Orim's Chant is 1 white, and it has kicker of 1 white, so you can pay an extra white as you play it. And it says target player can't play spells this turn if you paid the kicker cost. Creatures can't attack this turn either, so it also has that nice fog effect on it. Next, we have our draw card spells. Blue Sun Zenith is X and 3 blue for an instant. Target player draws X cards, and you get to shuffle Blue Sun Zenith back into its owner's library, hopefully to use it again and again and again. Next, we have Mind Spring, X and 2 blue for a sorcery, says draw X cards. Great. Next, we have Emergency Powers. 5, a white and a blue for an instant. Each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, then draws 7 cards. Then you exile Emergency Powers. And it has addendum, so if you cast this spell during your main phase, you may put a permanent card with converted mana cost 7 or less from your hand onto the battlefield. Super powerful card. Drawing cards and then able to put something CMC 7 or less from your hand on the battlefield. this is a, expertise card, basically, right? Like Sahili's expertise or something, or Rishkar's expertise. Really love those cards that draw you cards and let you cast something for free. That's just amazing. Next we have Sphinx's Revelation. X, a white and a blue and a blue. So that's 3 and X. For an instant, you gain X life and you draw X cards. Yeah, pretty great. Next we have Overflowing Insight, 4 and 3 blue for a sorcery. Target player draws 7 cards. Yeah, a lot of mana, but drawing 7 cards is nothing to shy at. Next we have a couple of ramp spells. We do have some artifacts in the deck. Mycosynth Wellspring is 2 mana for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield or is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. So even though we have artifact hate, we don't mind sacrificing this because then it works again. Next we have Sword of the Animist, 2 mana for an equipment, which has equip 2. Equipped creature gets +1/+1, which people often forget, so don't forget that. And whenever the equipped creature attacks, you may search your library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. So what's really great about Sword of the Animist is that the trigger happens on attack, the creature doesn't have to deal combat damage at all. It happens before anything else happens. You just say, I'm attacking with this creature, and now I get to search for a land and put it on the battlefield tapped. One of the better artifact ramps, but unfortunately it dies to a lot of our own removal. But, if it gets us a few triggers, I think it's done its job for a couple mana. Next we have Land Tax, 1 white for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, if an opponent controls more lands than you, you may search your library for up to 3 basic land cards, reveal them, and put them into your hand. If you do, shuffle your library. Really powerful effect for just 1 white mana. If you get this out early enough in the game, it can really help you out and filter those basic lands out of your deck. Alright, so next we have our 2 Planeswalkers. Venser the Sibir Sojourner, excuse me, Venser the Sojourner, gonna have to look that one up in the dictionary. So 3, a white and a blue for a Planeswalker that enters with 3 loyalty counters. And for +2, you can exile target permanent you own and return it to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. So that's our little flicker effect there again. Oh, there's my dog's barking. Just a sec. Hey! Quiet! Quiet! Trying to record a video here. Alright, next, Venser says you can -1 to give all creatures unblockable this turn. Really helpful for getting in that damage. Next, you can -8, and you get an emblem with whenever you cast a spell, you get to exile any target permanent. Yeah, really great removal there if you can get to it. Next, we have Dovin Bond, 2, a white and a blue for a Planeswalker that also enters with 3 loyalty counters. And you can +1, and until your next turn, up to 1 target creature gets -3/-0, and its activated abilities can't be activated. For -1, you can gain 2 life and draw a card, and for -7, you get an emblem with your opponents can't untap more than 2 permanents during their untap steps. Really powerful if you can get that off. Next, we got our removal package. So, starting with targeted removal, we have Swords to Plowshares, 1 white for an instant. You exile target creature, its controller gains life equal to its power. So yeah, there's a downside there, but for just 1 white at instant speed, a really powerful card. Same with Path to Exile, 1 white for an instant, exile target creature, its controller may search his or her library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle his or her library. Less of a downside than Swords to Plowshares, but both are really great cards. Next you have Declaration in Stone, 1 and a white for a sorcery. You exile target creature and all other creatures its controller controls with the same name as that creature. That player investigates for each non-creature token exiled this way. So investigates means they get to make a clue token, which they can pay 2 mana and sacrifice to draw a card. Thankfully with our deck, we have plenty of artifact hate, and we can make those clue tokens just useless. So Declaration of Stone is especially powerful in artifact hate decks like this one. Next we have Austere Command, 4 and 2 white for a sorcery, and you get to choose 2. Either destroy all artifacts, destroy all enchantments, destroy all creatures with converted mana cost 3 or less, or destroy all creatures with CMC 4 or greater. Next we have Cleansing Nova, 3 and 2 white for a sorcery, and you choose 1. Either destroy all creatures or destroy all artifacts and enchantments. Next we have Akroma's Vengeance, 4 and 2 white for a sorcery. Destroy all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. So just clear the board of everything. And it has cycling 3, so cycling means you can pay the cycling cost to discard it from your hand and just draw a card if you decided you didn't need it at the time, something like that. Next we have more board wipes with Supreme Verdict, 1, 2 white, and a blue, so 4 mana total, for a sorcery that can't be countered, and it says destroy all creatures. Yeah. And next we finally have Cyclonic Rift. Goes in every blue deck practically. 1 and a blue for an instant, return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand, or you can pay the overload cost, which is a total of 7 mana. If you pay the overload cost, you get to return all non-land permanents you don't control to their owner's hands. And what I personally really like doing is playing this in response to the opponent's cleanup step, so that they're going to have, basically that's their discard step, and so they're going to have to return all their non-land permanents to their hand, and then they're going to have to discard down to 7. Pretty brutal way to go about it. Next we have some more just like kind of pillow 40 effects. So these are spells that are going to protect us, especially if we can get them out early in the game. So Propaganda is 2 and a blue for an enchantment. Creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 mana for each creature he or she controls that's attacking you. Ghostly Prison is basically the same thing. 2 and a white for an enchantment. Creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 mana for each creature he or she controls that's attacking you. So if they're attacking you with 2 creatures, they have to pay a total of 4 mana in order for both of those creatures to be attacking you. So this deters a lot of players from attacking you and saves you a ton of damage for just 3 mana. Next we have Teferi's Protection, 2 and a white for an instant. Until your next turn, your life total can't change, and you have protection from everything, and all permanents you control phase out. So while they're phased out, they're treated as though they don't exist. They phase in before you untap, during your untap step, and then you have to exile Teferi's Protection. So it only works once. This spell will save you completely, save you from death. It's the perfect fog type effect. It saves all of your creatures. It even saves all of your tokens. The only downside is that it only works once, and that one time better be worth it, and you better be able to come back afterwards, or else your opponent will just, kill you the next turn. But yeah, it's definitely a great card that will save you. I'm really bummed that they've only printed this once. What's up with that? And it's only been printed in the Vampire deck, of all places. Like, what's up with Teferi and Edgar Markov? I guess they got the secret handshake going on or something. But yeah, if you're like me, I think we should all ask Wizards of the Coast to please reprint Teferi's Protection. This card's up to like $30 now, and it's kind of getting ridiculous, but really great spell. Next we have Stony Silence, 1 and a white for an enchantment. Activated abilities of artifacts can't be activated, so yeah, whatever artifacts, we hate you all. Next we have Gideon's Phalanx, 5 and 2 white for an instant. You get to put 4 2/2 white knight creature tokens with vigilance onto the battlefield, and it has spell mastery, so if there are 2 or more instant and or sorcery cards in your graveyard, creatures you control gain indestructible until the end of the turn. And that's not really hard to do. This was mostly put in the deck for that indestructible effect, but I also really wanted to just try the card out, so this is kind of my sentimental card. If you're the type of person who's like, oh, this card is really cool, I really want to put it in the deck, just remember this rule. I only leave room for like 1 sentimental card in each deck. And other than that, everything has to be like, in there for a reason. It has to be in there not because the artwork is cool or because I think the effect is cool. It has to work with the deck. So this is my sentimental card, but it also still mostly works for the deck as long as we have spell mastery. But I feel like getting 4 2/2 white knights, instant speed, and having them all be indestructible is really cool if you can have the 7 mana. Anyway, next we have Unbreakable Formation, 2 and a white for an instant. Creatures you control gain indestructible until the end of the turn, and it has Addendum. So if you cast this during your main phase, you put a +1/+1 counter on each of those creatures, and they gain Vigilance until the end of the turn. Next we have our land base. So starting with the lands that don't add colors. Again, we got some Eldrazi spells in the deck, so we want to have lands that, don't add color as well. So Thawing Glaciers is a land that enters tapped, and you can pay 1 and tap it to search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library, return Thawing Glaciers to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next next cleanup step. So really interesting card. I really just discovered it, but like I said, we don't have a lot of mono rocks in this deck, so this is one of my land ramps, and I think it's just really cool card. It doesn't add mana itself. It doesn't tap for mana, and it enters tap, so it's a little slow. But I feel like being able to repeatedly search your library for basic land, is just always powerful. I think it's a really cool card, especially on a land. Next, we have Reliquary Tower. It's a land that says you have no maximum hand size, and it taps to add 1 colorless. Moorland Haunt taps to add 1 colorless to your mana pool, or you can pay a white and a blue and tap it, and you exile a creature card from your graveyard, and you put a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying onto the battlefield. Next, we have Detection Tower. And Detection Tower taps to add a colorless to your mana pool, or you can pay 1 and tap it until the end of the turn. Your opponents and creatures your opponents control with hexproof can be the targets of spells and abilities you control as though they didn't have hexproof. So it doesn't save them from your other opponent's spells or abilities. It doesn't, make them legal targets for your other opponent's spells or abilities, but it makes them legal targets for your spells or abilities, at least. Same thing with Arcane Lighthouse. Taps to add a colorless, or you can pay 1 and tap it, and until the end of the turn, creatures your opponents control lose hexproof and shroud, and they can't have hexproof or shroud. So that's a little bit better than Detection Tower, for sure, but Detection Tower also gets around players having hexproof, so I think they're both really good and really perfect for the control deck here. Next, we have Temple of the False God, which taps to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. Activate this ability only if you control 5 or more lands. This is actually a land I put in every deck. I suggest you try it out. It has pretty much never failed me because, we're playing a late game format, a format where the games go a little bit longer, and if you're not up to 5 lands, then you're probably just losing the game anyway. Next, we have Homeward Path, which taps to add a colorless mana to your mana pool, or you can tap it, and each player gains control of all creatures he or she owns. So yeah, if anyone's trying to steal your creatures, you get Homeward Path out, and you get to steal them back. Next, we have our cycling lands. Secluded Step enters tapped, or you can tap it for a white mana, or you can pay a white and cycle it. So you discard it and you get to draw a card. So if you're mana flooded, you already have plenty of lands, and then you top deck Secluded Step or Lonely Sandbar or Irrigated Farmland. You can cycle all of these away to just draw another card, if you already have too much mana. So yeah, Lonely Sandbar enters tapped. It taps to add a blue, and you can cycle it away for 1 blue. Irrigated Farmland enters tapped. It's a Plains Island. It taps to add a white or a blue to your mana pool, or you can cycle it away for 2 mana. Next, we have Flooded Strand, which is a land that says tap it and pay 1 life and sacrifice it. Search your library for a plains or island card and put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. So Flooded Strand can get out Irrigated Farmland, Prairie Stream, Hollowed Fountain, anything that's a plains or an island. Doesn't have to be basic, and it doesn't necessarily enter tapped either, unless the card says it does. Next, we have Prairie Stream. Let me just get a drink of water here real quick. Okay, so Prairie Stream is a plains island, taps to add a blue or white, and it enters tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. Hollowed Fountain is a plains island, enters tapped unless you pay 2 life. Azorius Chancery is not a plains or an island, so that's the end of our plains islands, and it enters the battlefield tapped. And when it enters the battlefield, you have to return a land you control to its owner's hand. But the upside is this taps for both a white and a blue. So when you play this, try to make sure that you've already tapped the land that you're going to return to your hand, that you've already tapped it for mana, and that it's a land that's going to re-enter the battlefield untapped. And if you have Azorius Chancery or another bounce land in your opening hand, you want to be really careful and make sure that you're not going to have to discard by eventually having 8 cards because you had to return a land to your hand. So be careful of that. But I think these are all really great. Again, we're in a late game format, so these bounce lands are fabulous. You see people playing them all the time because they work. They add extra mana to your mana pool for the very small price of returning another land to your hand. And when you think about it, if you were playing green, you'd have to pay 2 mana at least to add an extra mana, mana to your total mana available. You'd have to pay 2 mana to get an extra land on the battlefield. I mean, you're basically doing the same thing here, just with the land, So really not bad at all. Alright, so continuing with our lands, we got Temple of Enlightenment, which enters tapped. It taps to add a blue or white to your mana pool, and when it enters the battlefield, you get to scry 1. So pretty helpful. Next we have Sea of Clouds. It enters tapped unless you have 2 or more opponents, and it taps to add a white or blue to your mana pool. Adarkar Wastes taps to add a colorless mana to your mana pool, or you can tap it for a white or a blue, and if you do, it deals 1 damage to you. Next we have Crowdcrest Lake. Taps to add a colorless mana to your mana pool, or you can tap it for a white or a blue. If you do, it doesn't untap during your next untap step. So, definitely a downside, but, when it comes to fixing mana, you do it. That's what you need to do. That's what you need to do. Next, we have Mystic Gate, which taps to add a colorless to your mana pool, or you can pay a white or a blue and tap it to add white, 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 blue, or blue, blue to your mana pool. So what this is saying is you can basically mana fix for any spell that you need. So, if something required you to have both 2 blue and you didn't have 2 blue, you just had this and another island, and something else, you can tap this to make whatever mana you want. It's a mana fixer, just kind of hard to explain to new players, unfortunately. Next we have Port Town. Port Town enters the battlefield. You may reveal a plains or island card from your hand. If you don't, it enters tapped, and it taps to add a blue or a white to your mana pool. Then we have Seachrome Coast. Seachrome Coast enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or fewer other lands, and it taps to add a white or blue to your mana pool. So this is great early on in the game. And finally, we have our basics: 8 plains and 8 islands, and that's it. That's Lavinia, Azorius Renegade. So let me know what you think of the deck. Let me know what you would do differently, what you'd throw in, and I guess that's about it. So until next time, this is Eric from Bane Alley Magic signing off. Take care. Take it easy.